There is a particular kind of grief that does not have a funeral. There are no flowers, no eulogies. No one shows up to hold your hand. It is the grief of a life that was lived for an institution, and the slow, devastating realization, sometimes years or even decades later, that so much of what was sacrificed never had to be lost at all. Every year, tens of thousands of people leave the organization known as Jehovah's Witnesses. Some leave quietly, slipping away from congregations in cities and towns around the world. Others are formally disfellowshipped, cast out through a judicial process that ends friendships, fractures families, and can leave a person entirely alone in a matter of days. And still others spend years in what is known as a fading, walking carefully toward the exit while trying not to trigger the organizational machinery that would cut them off from everyone they have ever loved. But regardless of how they leave, almost universally, former members describe a process that begins long after the initial exit. It is the process of looking back, of surveying the landscape of decisions made under the influence of the organization's teachings, of counting the cost, not in the abstract theological sense, but in the most human, tangible terms imaginable. Careers not pursued, relationships destroyed, years consumed by fear and guilt over things that were, in the end, entirely ordinary. These are not fringe voices. These are people who dedicated real decades of their lives, who knocked on doors in the rain, who skipped college, who stopped speaking to their own children because they genuinely believed they were obeying God. The question this video explores is not whether they were sincere. They were. The question is what that sincerity cost them, and what they wish, more than anything, they could go back and change. What follows are the 10 most profound, most frequently cited regrets shared by former Jehovah's Witnesses around the world. And before we begin, if any of these resonate, if any of them describe something that someone watching this has personally lived through, leave a comment below. These stories deserve to be heard, and if this kind of content matters to someone, a like goes a long way in making sure more people find it. Number 10, saved for last, is the one that former members consistently describe as the deepest, the one that, even years after leaving, still surfaces in the quiet moments. Stay until the end. Regret number 1. I lost my youth trying to be spiritually enough. Among the most common threads in the testimonies of former Jehovah's Witnesses is the memory of adolescence, not as a time of discovery, but as a prolonged exercise in spiritual performance. Former members describe teenage years spent calculating field service hours, preparing for meetings multiple times a week, attending assemblies and conventions, studying organizational literature, and carrying the constant, low-grade anxiety of never quite measuring up. While peers were navigating the normal chaos of growing up, first relationships, friendships that would last a lifetime, the experiments and mistakes and freedoms that shape a person's identity. Many young witnesses were instead managing an internal spiritual ledger. Was this week's report good enough? Did a particular thought or feeling make them impure? Was the music they privately enjoyed something that would bring shame if discovered? Former members speak of the guilt that attached itself to almost everything. A birthday party glimpsed through a neighbor's window. A crush that could not be acted on because the person was not a witness. A desire to go to university that was dismissed by elders and parents as spiritually dangerous. The pain of this particular regret, as former members articulate it, is not simply religious. It is the recognition that adolescence is not renewable, that the years between 14 and 21 exist once, and what is built, or not built, during those years shapes everything that follows. When that window closes and the realization arrives that it was spent in a kind of spiritual holding pattern, the grief can be profound. Regret number 2. I pushed away the people who actually loved me. The organizational culture of Jehovah's Witnesses draws a sharp and deliberate line between those inside the congregation and those outside it. Non-witnesses, even close friends, even family members who have left or never joined, are frequently described in organizational literature and from the platform as spiritually dangerous, as bad associations, whose influence could corrupt a member's faith. For many former members, this boundary was not merely theoretical. It was enacted in real relationships, in real time, often at great personal cost. Grandparents kept at a polite distance. Non-witness friends gradually dropped. Romantic interest rejected not for who they were, but for what religion they did or did not practice. Former members described the particular shame of looking back at specific people. A co-worker who offered genuine kindness, a relative who tried year after year to maintain a relationship, a childhood friend who eventually stopped reaching out, and understanding finally that those people had been good, that they had offered real love, and that it was rejected on organizational grounds. The tragedy many former members identify is that the organization taught them to protect themselves from the very people who might have offered them a different perspective before it was too late. And by the time that realization arrives, years or decades have passed. The people once pushed away have built lives without the person who once turned them aside. Some of them are no longer alive to reconcile with. Regret number 3. I judged people who were better than I was. The spiritual hierarchy within Jehovah's Witness congregations creates, intentionally or not, a culture of constant comparative evaluation. Members are assessed by elders, by families, by themselves, on visible markers of spiritual commitment. Hours in field service, attendance at meetings, comments from the platform, demonstrated loyalty to organizational direction. This culture of evaluation does not stay internal. Former members describe having absorbed a way of looking at people outside the organization, and even those within it who were considered spiritually weak, through a lens of quiet condescension. The single mother who worked on Sundays instead of attending meetings. The disfellowshipped neighbor. The co-worker who celebrated holidays. Former members recall viewing these individuals not simply as different, but as lesser. The regret that emerges after leaving is layered. There is shame at having carried that attitude. But beneath the shame is something more uncomfortable. The recognition that many of the people once judged were simply living honest, dignified human lives, experiencing joy, maintaining integrity, loving their families, entirely outside the framework that had been used to evaluate them. Former members frequently describe meeting, after their exit, people they once considered spiritually compromised, and discovering warmth, depth, and genuine goodness there. The realization that the judgment was always more about organizational conditioning than about actual moral perception is one that takes time to fully absorb. Regret number 4. I let career opportunities pass me by. For decades, official organizational teaching actively discouraged young witnesses from pursuing higher education. The reasoning was explicit. The end of this system of things was imminent. Armageddon was close. To spend years building a career or obtaining a university degree was portrayed as a failure of spiritual priorities, an investment in a world that would soon be destroyed. This teaching had concrete consequences in the lives of real people. Former members describe watching themselves or others make decisions, or allow decisions to be made for them, based on an institutional timeline that never materialized. Young people with academic potential were steered toward part-time work that would free up more time for field service. College scholarship offers were declined. Careers that required advanced degrees were deemed spiritually incompatible. Decades later, former members sit with the economic reality of those decisions. Retirement that should have been building for 30 years was not. Skills that could have been developed were not. Financial independence that would have changed the arc of their lives was never attained. And unlike youth or time or lost relationships, the financial consequences of these choices compound quietly and continuously, making them visible not once but every month for the rest of a person's life. Regret number 5. I spent years waiting for a world that never ended. The history of Jehovah's Witnesses is inseparable from the history of unfulfilled prophetic timelines. The organization's predecessors predicted the end of the world with specific dates: 1914, 1925, 1975 among the most prominent. And when those dates passed without the promised event, the teachings were adjusted rather than retracted. But for the individuals living inside these expectations, the adjustments came only after real decisions had already been made. Former members describe structuring their entire adult lives around the conviction that the current world system was ending soon. Why save for retirement in a world that would not reach retirement age? Why pursue long-term goals when the organization taught that those who stayed spiritually faithful would survive into a paradise earth? The regret is not simply theological disappointment. It is the sober accounting of every decision that was shaped by that expectation. The children not had, the houses not bought, the adventures not taken, the education not pursued. All of it calibrated to an ending that never came. And when enough years have passed that the expectation becomes impossible to sustain, that realization does not arrive gently. For many former members, it is the moment the entire structure of their life's logic collapses. Regret number 6. I cut off people from my own family. Shunning. The practice of completely severing contact with disfellowshipped or disassociated former members is among the most documented and legally contested practices of Jehovah's Witnesses. Courts in Norway, the European Court of Human Rights, and judicial bodies across multiple nations have examined it. Former members have testified about it, and yet within the organization, it continues to be taught as a divine requirement. The human cost of this practice is immense. Former members describe years, in some cases decades, of not speaking to their own children, of returning holiday cards unopened, of watching, from a distance, the milestones in a child's or sibling's life, graduations, weddings, grandchildren, that they were not permitted to attend. All of it justified, at the time, as loyalty to God's standards. What makes this regret particularly devastating is the irreversibility at its edges. Some of the people former members cut off have died during the years of shunning. Some relationships were severed for so long that they could never be fully restored, even when the shunning finally ended. The years do not return, and the realization that institutional obedience was placed above the most fundamental human bonds, the bonds of parent and child, is one that many former members carry for the rest of their lives. Regret number 7. I silenced my own doubts. Doubt, within the organizational framework of Jehovah's Witnesses, is not treated as a natural feature of genuine inquiry. It is treated as a symptom of spiritual weakness, of outside influence, of the beginning of apostasy. Members who voice questions about doctrine, history, or organizational decisions are warned. Those who persist risk being labeled spiritually dangerous to others. This creates a powerful internal mechanism of suppression. Former members describe having had doubts, serious, substantive, intellectually honest doubts, for years before leaving. Questions about chronology, questions about blood transfusion policies, questions about the organization's relationship to the United Nations, questions about why certain teachings had changed so dramatically over time. But instead of following those questions, many former members report having practiced a kind of internal discipline against them, pushing the doubts down, attributing them to personal weakness, redoubling spiritual activity as a way of drowning out the internal voice. The regret for many is the knowledge that the information necessary to make an informed decision was available long before they accessed it. That had they given their own minds permission to ask questions earlier, they might have found their way out years sooner. That suppressing doubt was not, in the end, an act of faith. It was an act of self-abandonment. Regret number 8. I felt guilty for being human. There is a particular cruelty in being taught that normal human experience is spiritually compromising. Former members describe extensive internal inventories of guilt. Guilt over music that moved them. Guilt over films that made them feel something. Guilt over friendships that developed naturally with people outside the congregation. Guilt over physical attraction. Guilt over the desire to celebrate, to mark occasions, to engage with the ordinary rituals of human community. Holidays were forbidden. Birthdays were treated as pagan. Competitive sports were viewed with suspicion. Certain forms of entertainment were catalogued as spiritually dangerous. Friendships that moved too close to outsiders were monitored and commented on. Former members describe spending years walking through ordinary life with a kind of constant spiritual surveillance, an internalized warden checking each impulse, each pleasure, each ordinary human moment against a long list of prohibitions. Many report that they did not recognize, until years after leaving, how much energy that surveillance consumed, or how thoroughly it estranged them from the simple capacity to enjoy being alive. Regret number 9. I gave my absolute trust to men. The governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, a small group of men based in Warwick, New York, is presented within the organization not as a committee of administrators, but as the channel through which God communicates to humanity in the present day. Their directives, carried through organizational publications, videos, and assembly talks, are to be followed without independent verification. To question their guidance is explicitly framed, in organizational language, as questioning God Himself. For former members, the unraveling of this belief is among the most psychologically disorienting experiences of the exit process. As they begin researching the organization's actual history, the failed prophecies, the changes in blood policy over decades, the handling of child abuse cases, the legal settlements, the relationship with the United Nations, they encounter a portrait of an institution that has made repeated, serious, consequential errors that affected the lives and deaths of real people. errors that were never genuinely acknowledged or atoned for. The regret former members describe here is not simply intellectual, it is the visceral recognition that their trust, the most complete form of trust a person can extend, the trust of spiritual submission, was placed in fallible men who claimed an authority they did not possess, and that this trust shaped decades of decisions that cannot be unmade. Regret number 10. I passed it all on to my children. This is the regret that former members consistently describe last, the one that takes the longest to surface and the longest to speak out loud. And for many, it is the one that never fully resolves. Leaving the organization is, for adults, a profound and often agonizing process. The reconstruction of identity, of relationships, of a worldview, all of it is hard. But the adults who leave carry with them the knowledge that they chose this path, that they were, at some level, agents in their own lives, even if that agency was deeply constrained. Their children were not. Former members who raised children inside the organization describe watching their sons and daughters absorb, as children do, entirely, without filters, the same fears, the same guilt, the same suppression of doubt, the same mistrust of the outside world, the same anticipation of Armageddon. They describe watching their children refuse blood transfusions, watching their children walk away from university, watching their children shun their own friends, watching their children cut contact with family members, and doing nothing to stop it, because at the time, they believed it was right. The grief of this particular regret is unlike any of the others because it is not solely about the life one lived. It is about the lives that were shaped by that life. Children who are now adults carrying their own wounds. Children who may have already left the organization themselves and are now sitting with their own inventory of losses. Children who are still inside, unreachable, because the same shunning doctrine that once seemed holy now stands between a parent and the child they are no longer permitted to know. Former members describe this regret as the one that has no clean resolution. There is no study course, no therapy session, no amount of advocacy work that erases the fact that they handed their children the same cage they were eventually able to escape. Some of those children have found their way out. Some have not. And some of the relationships that might have helped bridge that distance were lost in the process of leaving. This is not a story about bad people. It is a story about the specific and measurable damage that an institution can do when it places its own authority above the natural conscience of its members. When it teaches parents to fear the world so thoroughly that they teach their children to fear it too. And when it does all of this while insisting, at every step, that it is the only voice of God on earth. 10 regrets. 10 categories of loss that former Jehovah's Witnesses describe, in their own words, again and again, across countries and cultures and decades. Youth that cannot be returned. Relationships that could not be repaired. Trust that was misplaced. Doubt that was silenced. Guilt that was completely unearned. Careers that were never built. Prophecies that were never fulfilled. Families that were shattered by institutional decree. Children who were handed a worldview they never chose. This video is not an indictment of the people who live inside the organization. Most of them are sincere. Most of them are doing what they genuinely believe is right. That sincerity is real, and it deserves to be treated with respect. But sincerity does not protect a person from consequence. And the consequences documented here are not theoretical. They are the lived testimony of hundreds of thousands of real people who made it out and are now, in many cases, spending years rebuilding what was lost. If this video found someone who is currently asking questions, who is in that place of private doubt that so many former members describe, it is worth knowing that asking those questions is not apostasy. It is not spiritual weakness. It is one of the most human things a person can do, and if this video found someone who has already walked that road, who carries any of these regrets, who is still in the middle of the rebuilding, leave a comment. Share the one that resonated. Because one of the most powerful things that can happen after this kind of experience is the simple realization that someone else understands exactly what was lost and exactly how it happened. Like this video if it meant something. Subscribe if this kind of content matters. And keep talking. These stories deserve to be heard.